Hey everyone, welcome to the Let's Talk from the Hashnode Bootcamp Season 3. I'm so excited, I'm blabbering. This season's bootcamp focuses on building an effective personal brand as a developer. As usual, we have another amazing speaker from which we can learn a lot. We are really excited to host this edition and to learn from these amazing speakers and from Samson specifically. This is all from myself, and I'll hand it off to Edidiong to talk a little bit more about Hashnode and about us.
Awesome. I'm not sure if you can see me. Can you see me?
Yep.
All right, cool. Hi, everyone. Welcome once again to the final session of the Hashnode Bootcamp. My name is Edidiong Asikpo. I work as a developer advocate at Hashnode. I really love writing technical articles, building developer communities, and contributing to open source. I'm hosting this session with my amazing friend and colleague, Catalin, who also works as a developer advocate at Hashnode. He loves sharing insightful tech articles on his blog and his YouTube channel. And in his spare time, he loves to write quads and play PC games. I bet you already know this, but just to give you a bit of a refresher, Hashnode is a free dev blogging platform for developers centered around giving you an opportunity to create a blog in under 2 minutes and map it to your custom domain and also get visibility from the developer community. At the end of this session, after Samson is done, we'll be answering questions. So if you have any questions, feel free to click on the questions tab at the right, type in your question, and we would respond to it after that. Then don't forget to share what you're learning about this particular session of the bootcamp and the Hashnode Bootcamp in general. Use hashtag Hashnode Bootcamp. We'll be giving our swags to the top 10 interesting tweets we see online. So don't forget to add the hashtag, because that's the only way we'd see it. Thank you.
Today, we have Samson Goddy. I hope I pronounce your name properly. I don't know how to pronounce English words properly most of the time, so feel free to correct me. Samson is going to talk about growing with open source contributions. Contributing to open source is a great way to give back to the community and improve your programming skills. Samson is a software engineer and an open source advocate. He's primarily maintaining Sugar Labs projects, and he co-founded the Open Source Community Africa. It's important to know that he's on the board. He's one of the board members for Open Source Collective, a project that helps sustain open source projects through the Open Source Collective platform. I think that tells us enough, and it should make you really interested in his talk about open source, because I'm surely am. Please give a warm welcome to Samson in the chat. Say welcome. Let him know how excited you are to listen to this talk. That's all about from me, and now I'll hand it over to Samson to present us and to share his knowledge.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. I don't know, can everybody see me? I can imagine. Okay. So before I start, I'll probably just share my slides. I'm one of the most horrible people when it comes to slides, so please forgive me because I'm a huge fan of slides. Let me see if you can. I don't know if you can see my slides. Can you guys see my slides? I don't know, because it doesn't. Oh, okay, great, that makes sense. All right. So my name is Samson Goddy, and I'm excited here today. I'm really excited from the Hashnode team for inviting me to come speak. I'll be particularly focusing on growing in open source because, as a software engineer or a technical writer or even a designer coming from a non-code background, the technology we have today, particularly in 2021, is very centered around open source. And I'm sure that at some point, some persons might be asking, hey, what is open source and how I can grow with open source? But the focus of this talk is not to particularly define what open source is, because I think there's a lot of articles on Hashnode that you can check. Edidiong particularly writes about open source. Balaji and some other friends of mine that writes a lot on Hashnode already covers great articles. So you can go in and search more about open source. But particularly this section is to share my personal story and on my opinions about how you can grow, in open source. So first, a little bit of introduction. I'm the co-founder for a open source group called the Open Source Community Africa. If you're in Africa and or maybe you're a huge fan of open source, you might have come across something called the Open Source Festival. So Open Source Community Africa is behind the awesome Open Source Festival, which was launched and created in sometime in 2020. One of the best moments of my life before COVID happened. So recently I joined a company called SourceGraph. So SourceGraph as a company and SourceGraph as a tool is a universal code search where you can search any code by just figuring out like chunk of code and making things smaller. So it's a very interesting tool. You can check it out, particularly if you're interested in open source going forward. And if you follow me on Twitter, you'll most likely start seeing some content coming up from it. So excited about joining the company. So it's also one of the things about going in open source, and now particularly on my role. So yeah, also part of a open source project called the Open Source Collective. So Open Source Collective is particularly more focused around finances and helping organizations like Open Source Community Africa to raise money and stay in open source. So it's one of the proudest projects that I'm part of, and I'm excited that at some point we're really going forward. Um, and also, I've been a long-term contributor for a project called Sugar Labs. It's a educational project that focuses on creating tools and resources for education through open source. So it's really really great to talk about it. And part of a program also called the GitHub Star. So some of the to be part of particularly. Oh, my slides are gone. That is strange. Uh, Failed to share the slide. For some reason, I don't have permission to share the slide, which is okay. Okay, let me see if I can share it again. Is it working? I guess it's working now. Oh, great, awesome. So I'm part of a program called GitHub Star. It's one of the coolest things that I like doing these days. So I talk about GitHub sometimes. So I'm excited that the company made me part of the global effort. Yeah, so just before I come and talk about growing open source, it's just to give you some little bit of recap of what open source is. So in my own term, it's literally anything that gives you the ability for you to modify and to create your own version, right? So um, I try not to define open source from a code perspective because there's a lot of people, including on this talk, that may be coming from an engineering background, and some of the definitions of open source comes from a very very technical term. But it's just the ability for you to be able to work on things, to share, and to basically to modify. So that's what my own term open source comes from. And one of the things about open source is how great community works, right? So I started my first entry into open source was when I was 8 years old. So that's a very long time ago. I was much younger. I just got into junior high, for people that are familiar with the Nigerian system, junior secondary school. So it's the first opportunity for me to like collaborate, and that's one of the things that makes open source great. Is just how awesome the community works. And so this is a very interesting quote from the open source guide. So you can Google open source. I think it's called open source guide dot. Can't remember the URL, but I'll probably share it later on. But it's on GitHub, and they have a lot of resources on open source, how to start your open source project, how to collaborate, how to even build a team. So it's a lot of resources that you can check out, particularly if you're interested in about starting your project or maybe jumping into an open source project. But the point here is, contributing to open source can be a rewarding way for you to learn, to teach, and for you to build experience. And that's the whole point of this conversation. The conversation here is how does somebody grow in open source? Open source as an ecosystem gives you the opportunity to become a mentor and now also a mentee, but also gives the opportunity for you to learn while you're doing. So you don't necessarily need to focus on just learning a particular skill and becoming better at it before you jump on a code or jump on a project or jump on a community, but it gives you an opportunity for you to do both. So that means you could be learning about a new technology, you could be learning how to become a technical writer, you could be learning how to design screens while you're contributing back to open source. So that's one of the great thing about open source and open source community. So open source journey. I've been in open source for roughly 13 to 14 years old. Right now, so I've been a huge and a long-term contributor for open source. Like I mentioned, I originally started when I was 8 years old, and when I started, it was based on the fact that I had the opportunity to have a tool that was 100% open source. So my first ever computer was running Linux, and because it was running Linux, I had a tendency or I was kind of forced to go learn some basic Linux commands because it was really, really heavily on terminal. So that was the first time I got introduced to terminal. It was really crazy for an 8-year-old because my parents works on Windows and clicking stuff and installing things while I'm basically going to Google and searching about command line. So it was one of the horrible experience for me as an 8-year-old kid, which was technically not so fun, but it also helps me now better understand what Linux works. But because of the tool I had as a kid, that got me interested into open source. So my first ever machine was about 1 gig of RAM, I think, and about I think 1 gig of internal memory and about 520 megabytes of RAM. So imagine how low that computer was compared to what I'm currently using right now. So it was running a version of Linux called Sugar Labs. Sorry, not Sugar Labs, Sugar OS. So Sugar OS is developed by Sugar Labs, which is a project that I've been a long-term contributor of. So Sugar Labs basically create a tool that enables people like myself that are in school to better understand science and mathematics, right? So I was able to use the desktop environment as my learning tool, but also I was able to take it home and to work on tools. So because the computer was Linux, and for people that are heavily Linux users know how frustrating some tools and some things can work. It's basically an opportunity for you to customize and to do things based on your own taste. So I went to Google and I was doing a lot of Google search, and I figured out that the operating system was purely written in Python. So there's a particular version of Python called the PyGTK. So it's the GNOME toolkit, but for Python version, because the original GNOME toolkit was written in C. And as an 8-year-old, it's kind of going to be a bit impossible, not necessarily impossible, but a little bit crazier for an 8-year-old kid to be learning how to write C. So it was easier for me. A year after, I think I was between my 9 to 10 years old, I started writing Python. So the way I was writing Python was not just to understand Python programming language as an expert, but also to learn a chunk of code that was easier and for me to be able to modify the system I was using, because again it's a purely open source operating system, much better than what I'm using right now. So I was able to customize, I was able to do bug fixes, and what that does to me, or what that was able to do for me, was to kind of connect me with the community that was behind the project. So what that happened was I learned Python and I was working on some tool that I was doing by myself, and then I found out this awesome community called Sugar Labs, and then I reached out to the community, telling them about my interest as a not just a user but also a potential contributor. So I jumped into Sugar Labs while learning Python, and I started working on some interesting projects that made me better understand how Python works. And I would say one of the highlights for me growing in open source and even learning programming was when I had the opportunity to port. So there was this online flash game for people that are much of an OG on online games. Remember when games were based on Adobe Flash Player? So there was a game playing that was heavily dependent on the Flash Player. But Adobe Flash doesn't natively support Linux. So it was harder for me to like bring that game offline and also bring it into my system and play offline, because internet is a problem, particularly in the side of the world that I'm based. So what I did was I was able to look online on some chunk of code that was that was designed for me for any person to create a window that would run Flash Player natively on Linux. So that was my first time project, the first project that I wrote. And that was actually the first time, I think a year before, the first time I also I heard about GitHub around 2012, 2013. So I created my first GitHub account within that year. And when I created the version of the game, it was running locally for me, and I shared it within my peers. And I actually shared it within, because again, I was in an educational environment. I was able to share the code, and people started playing the game. It was really awesome because I was really getting direct feedback as a kid. So it was like launching my own project, but when I was much younger, and I deployed it, a lot of persons started in giving me direct feedback. So when I eventually shared the code publicly through GitHub and Sugar Labs, within the Labs ecosystem, because Sugar Labs have their own version of Play Store for the operating system, it got about 36,000 downloads. I think under 6 months, the project got about 36,000 downloads, and that is including from the Play Store or the App Store. So it's not something mobile. It was not something on the Windows Store. It was something very specific on the Linux machine. So having that ability to attract that numbers of downloads as a kid got me really interested in coding, and that basically helps improve my mentality. I started working collaboratively. I started leaving my comfort zone. I started leaving out things that I know as a kid and started approaching the world of technology more. I started working with more advanced engineers. And even, in fact, some of my mentors as a kid was, I think, one of my mentor, Mary Lou Jepson, she was the one that originally designed the Google X project, the glass. For people that are familiar with that project, I think she left Google, became, I think, one of the Facebook exec, and then she was the one that led the team for the Oculus project. So I was really exposed to a lot of people. Eventually, after some years back, I started working with folks from Massachusetts Institute of Technology and also Harvard. I think a couple years after I started working on some educational content, then I started switching from engineering into more of a content-based project in the open source. So that is also one of the things about open source. You have a lot of flexibility to kind of move around and to kind of see what are things that you love as a person. So I eventually traveled to the US for the first time around 2017, and I originally went to, which is one of the things I posted here. I was a tour for Google Summer of Code a couple years ago, and I was invited by Google to come talk about how to improve the program at Silicon Valley. So that was the first time I traveled to the US, and it was really awesome for me because of the project that I've been with together. So that was just kind of gives you the idea on the place I'm coming from when it comes to open source, and to show that with open source you have the ability to kind of like move around and to kind of like see things irrespective of who you are, right? I was this 8-year-old kid in Port Harcourt in a community school with less internet, and I started working and supporting projects worldwide. I eventually moved over and started supporting programs from Google, and moved over to Boston to start working on project that was live from MIT. It just gives you that opportunity that there's no boundaries, or there's no setbacks. So even if you do have some things that could be based on your color of your skin, there's a lot of things that could come that most people in these days sort of noticed in the technology space. Open source is so designed with things like code of conduct that makes things a lot easier for you to come in and to feel welcome. There's a lot of awesome community out there, like my own community called the Sugar Labs and Open Source Community Africa. So to kind of get started, and I think this is something that is quite interesting, and to kind of break a lot of things down. And this is a step that I would recommend literally to anybody. So the first thing is to kind of find an open source project. So one of the way I always tell people to find projects is if they're in the engineering side, you're learning a programming language, you could basically start from the things that you love, or tool that you love. It could be the way your team for VS Code. It could be some tool that you like that is open source, and you can start from there. Or you could go to github.com/explorer or /topics, or you could look out for projects like Ovio. Ovio is a very interesting project that helps you to kind of that sort of filters project based on your interest. So ovio.org, if you're interested, you can go check it out. They ask you some questions about your experience and your interest, and then they give you projects based on that. But also GitHub also offers that similar approach by telling you trending projects, and I think projects on your interests, including languages. And then the next thing is basically to join a community. So I run a project called the Open Source Community here in Africa, called the Open Source Community Africa, and that's just one of the million, I think probably 1,000 the community that you can be part of. Because when you're part of a community, you have the opportunity to receive direct mentorship, right? Not just go on Twitter and start asking somebody random, but when you're in a community and you show a very good interest, it's just very typical, very natural for somebody to come and help you to basically help grow your career, and how somebody helped me when I was working on open source in my earlier stage. And the other thing that I always like telling people, particularly the newbies coming in open source within the last couple of years, is to kind of focus on quality contributions instead of quantity. So quantity kind of sounds fun because it might give a lot of green stuff on your GitHub and shows that you're kind of pretty serious, but that does not technically translate to your to quality contributions. And if you're interested in building your career, building your stuff in GitHub. And if you go to my GitHub, it's kind of a bit complicated because I don't really have too much greens, and I'm not saying you shouldn't do the same. You should try to advantage of GitHub as much as possible, but you should try to focus on quality contributions because that enables you to like use that for future reference. If you're trying to interview for a job, and it's easier for you to like reference what you've worked on, and that helps mainly if you're hunting for jobs. And then the fourth point is basically to collaborate, learn, and to grow. So one thing about my life is, irrespective of how experienced I've been in the open source space, I always learn from people, even people that I mentor recently, because I give room for me to be able to be not just a mentor, but also be a potential mentee. Or in the educational world, we call it learning while doing, right? So as you're doing, or you're teaching somebody, you create a system that enable you to learn from new things, because that kind of keeps you more updated, and it keeps you more relevant into today's world. So the ability for you to collaborate, to learn, and to grow is a very key soft skill you want to have as a technologist as of 2021. Because for things like remote jobs, you would definitely want to have a great collaborative experience. You want to have a great learning experience, and you also want to have a great growth experience. So these are things that open source in general just gives you as more of a standard package. And then obviously the last one is open source your growth. What this means in general is basically to share your experience. Hashnode is a very interesting blogging platform where you can come and tell your day-to-day life. You can come and talk about the open source tool you're using. You can talk about things that you're collaborating. And by writing on Hashnode and doing a whole lot of things, kind of makes it easier for people to see how to work with you in the future, and even people giving you jobs. And to give you a kind of tip, I can't remember the last time I applied for a job, because because I was able to open source my growth. I was able to tell people what I do, and some of the jobs I started doing, including the job that I'm doing right now, was based on referral. So people are like, hey, I know something. Something has this particular skill, and I think something's going to be great on this role, or going to be great on this project, or going to be great in this particular subject matters. And that's the whole point about sharing. The ability for you to share is really golden, and that's something that you need to have if you're particularly interested in growing in open source. So one of the things people always ask me is, what are the ways I can come and contribute in open source? Open source is so broad; it's bigger than open source software. So there's the open source side of things, and there's the open source software side of things. On the open source software side of things, there's things like licensing. There's a lot of things that kind of involves around the project, and it may be a little bit restrictive if you're trying to explore, particularly on the non-code standpoint. But a lot of these days, project these days have expanded and trying to focus on open source community itself. So this means there's a lot of things that you could do that is not necessarily writing code. For example, you could be a designer, you could be a developer, you could be a researcher, you could be a QA and tester, you could be a donor, someone that donates money to open source project. You could research, you could be a user, you could be a translator, you could be a product manager. And trust me, and funny enough, I technically has I've done literally all this in source. I've designed previously. I've done research. Obviously, I started as a developer. I started testing software. I became a technical writer. I did research. I started donating back to open source. I started engaging people in open source. I became a translator. In fact, I did originally translate the three most popular languages in Nigeria, on an operating system called Sugar. So that's something that I did as part of my open source journey. So it just kind of gives you that opportunity that you can do whatever you want to do, and then see the things that are most appealing to you and things that you're very, very passionate about. So open source kind of gives you the sweet spot about growth and passion, and then just brings them together. So right now, I'm so excited about my job because that is what open source was able to do for me to kind of know that, hey, this is something that I can do and I can do better. I think the next thing here is oh, so that's basically it. I tried to make the slide as short as possible. As I originally said, I'm really horrible when it comes to slides, but that just kind of gives you an idea of what open source can do to you. Remember, just to give you a recap, I started as an 8-year-old kid with a confused person with a Linux machine in sometime I can't remember what year was that. I was in school. I was just naive. I was trying to do a lot of things. I was so excited. But fast forward to 2021. Right now, I'm a director of community for a very interesting company, and I've obviously done a lot of things to these jobs, and definitely reached out to one of the top big fours. I've done some collaborations. I've run communities. I've built a lot of things. I've built projects that have attracted thousands of downloads. So it just kind of gives you an opportunity of what open source can do for you as an individual, and also gives you the opportunity to see and to network. Some of my best friends these days are from open source community. Even Edidiong that works at Hashnode, we got to know each other through open source. That just gives you an opportunity of an idea of the opportunities that open source can do too, and just kind of like sum it up there. So, anyways, I try not to make this talk as long as possible because I know long talks these days can be crazy. So thank you very much, everybody, and thanks for having me here.
Oh, I don't know what happened.
Hey, Edidiong.
Hi, can you see me?
Yeah, I can see you. I can see you.
Okay, I don't know what's wrong with Emmett. Okay, thank you so much for the amazing session. That was really fantastic. And truth be told, I've definitely seen tons of Can you still hear me, Samson?
Yeah, I can hear you. I can hear you. I can hear you pretty well.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Like something going on with my Emmett for some reason. Anyway, yes, I was that open source has definitely impacted my life in various ways. So I totally agree with like what you said in this session, and I would encourage everybody who has listened to like try out open source, like try to make a contribution. You don't have to be like a software engineer to contribute to open source. So thank you so much for this amazing session. So we're going to start with start answering some questions. We have received tons of questions, so try to answer like 3 or 5 depending on the time we have. So the first question is, as a new developer, how do you suggest searching for beginner stroke entry open source projects?
So there are two ways that's a very interesting question. I didn't know why I didn't touch that. There are two ways that you could jump on as a beginner. So you can come from the program. So the companies like Google and some other companies, and including some open source projects, they have built a lot of programs that kind of help you to have a straight path into open source. So one of the most popular ones, I think I probably need to go back to my slide, probably I will just mention it, is Google Summer of Code. Google Summer of Code is designed if you're in the university, if you're in a educational setting, you're in your university or doing your degree. Is a program that is designed for you to just come in, and then there's a lot of projects that are in that umbrella. All you just need to do is to come in with your skill, and then you get accepted and you start working. And there are people that are designed and designed to help you when it comes to mentorship. So that is one way. The second way is if you're independent, you're away from school, if you're from the technical writing, or someone that is interested in writing technical documentation, Google Season of Docs, which is not tied to school, or you can jump on those programs and it helps you basically the same way that Google Summer of Code runs, but in a more of a technical roadmap. And there's another program called Outreach. Outreach is also very specific. Not specific, it's very broad, but it helps on the underrepresented communities. So, Africa and other parts, or, women, black male, people that are not necessarily represented in the open source space. Outreach kind of pays you to like come in and do a lot when it comes to open source. So, but if you're not in any of these programs and you want to just come straight, like I mentioned before, you can go to the most popular code house, the way I like calling GitHub. You can go there because that's where most of the open source repositories are. You can go to github.com/explore or /topics, or you can go to github.com and try to navigate around. But try to use the explore button or the top button, or I think there's interest. I can't remember. But these things sort of help you to like filter things that you're passionate about and things that you want to basically jump on. So it's a lot easier basically finding a project. But you don't necessarily need to be a creator of Python or a creator of JavaScript to be able to work on software projects. So yeah.
Sorry, I had to jump in as Edidiong's internet went off.
Sure.
Okay, thank you for the answer. And before I jump in, I want to ask if this question was asked beforehand because the connection is poor on my side. So as a new developer, how would you suggest searching for beginner and entry open source projects?
Yeah. So that I just answered that. That was the last. Yeah.
Okay, I'll just move this to answer. So the next one is, how can we express our contributions to open source in LinkedIn profile?
Oh, you mean how to add your open source contributions in your LinkedIn? Okay. So I'm not a big person or big user of LinkedIn, but I know it has the ability for you to put experiences. So in fact, I would say 70% of my experience in the software world is coming from open source. I'm able to share that with LinkedIn, right? So you have the option to add either as a volunteering project or as an actual experience. So you can feel free to add projects that you're involved with. Some of the people that I've worked with previously, currently adds the things that we're working on your LinkedIn profile. It also gives people an idea of your strength. In fact, these days, open source is kind of the de facto on some certain roles. So it's awesome. It's great that you should put it out there in your Twitter and also in your LinkedIn.
Awesome. All right, next question is by Shard. It's sometimes contributing to a new open source project feels intimidating. How do we go about exploring the repository in order to understand what's going on?
Yeah. So there's open source it's a very big word. It's a lot of different personas. And when I mean personas, a lot of skill sets, a lot of diversity in there, including projects. There's a lot of projects that can be a little bit confusing, including languages. So like projects like GitHub and the way GitHub is structured, and the way people like myself that works with open source projects, we often advise projects to take some certain steps. So if you're approaching a project and you're a bit confused, I always recommend people to look for contributing.md file in any repository, because that is where a typical open source maintainer would tell you how to best approach a project, right? So you obviously have to go through the doc route. So in this case, if you're trying to contribute to Sugar Labs, right, or Sugar Labs in this case, you can go to github.com/Sugar Labs, and then there's something called Sugar Docs. Clicking on Sugar Docs, there's a README file that shows step-by-steps on how to contribute based on your skill set. But then if you're confused, you're not sure on what to do, you can always refer back to something called the mailing list. There's a point of contact, the individuals you can reach out to. You always go to their public chat channel. Way back, there was something called IRC. I'm not sure how many projects use this IRC to date, but there's a lot of ways that you can go and talk to public projects and talk to project publicly. Remember, try to keep your conversation publicly, because when you ask things publicly, it helps a lot of people to give you more feedback and on ways to approach something instead of trying to send in a private DM. Private DMs are not necessarily recommended in open source, because if you reach out to me myself and Edidiong we work with Open Source Community Africa, and if you're interested in contributing to Open Source Community Africa and you send me a private DM, I'm not somebody that usually respond a lot to my Twitter DMs. Edidiong might be doing a little bit better than, but just because you decided to go to the private DM route, that sort of makes your experience in Open Source Community Africa a little bit hectic. But tweeting at both of us or approaching the public chat or coming to the Discord kind of gives me and Edidiong and also other members the opportunity to help you and onboard you into the program. So that's the approach that I would advise somebody that is a little bit confused on how to approach a project.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So just to add to what you said about trying to be more open, right, not sending messages via DM. So I think just like the name implies, open source, right? Open. There's a reason why they added open there. It means you should just be comfortable with being open about like whatever you're doing. So do you need like help with something? Don't like, oh hey, you don't know enough, right? Just be really comfortable with being open about sharing like whatever issues you're having, and someone will definitely jump in to help you. All right, that was fantastic. So the next question, how do we express, okay, I think this has already been answered. How do you express our contributions to open source and LinkedIn profiles? You've answered that already, yeah?
Yeah, I just did. I said it's easier. Just to kind of put on that. Always try to share what you're working on, and that's what the whole point of open source. To share things that on LinkedIn, and it gives you the opportunity for other people to see what you're up to, and then they jump on. They look for ways to collaborate. So you can share your job, things you work on LinkedIn. I think there's an option for volunteering and experience. Part. Not a huge fan of LinkedIn, but yeah.
All right, that makes sense. All right, this next question is not necessarily about the bootcamp, but it says, what's your camera? Your video, it's super clear and high resolution.
What's my camera? Okay.
Yeah.
So I'm using the Logitech Brio 4K webcam. So I often share a lot on my workstation setup. I'm still building my workstation. So if you follow me on Twitter, I can probably list a lot of things. But that's what I'm using right now. I think the 4K option is on. I think maybe that's why it's a little bit clearer.
Yeah, it is clear. All right. So the next question is, in your experience, what features should an open source project have to be successful? For example, should it have a community, open licenses, goals, purposes, etc.? So what do you think an open source organization or project should have in order to make it stand out and become successful?
So my experience in building open source, I've been part of building an open source project and also in the community, and the same thing happens abroad across each other, whether it's a software project or if it's a community-focused project. First is documentation. I can keep saying documentation forever. Documentation is very important because this is the way this is the opportunity for you to explain what that community is all about to the external and future contributors. In order for you to do that better, you have to make sure that you have people like things like maybe if you're on GitHub, you put your documentation out there. Always make sure it's as simple as possible. Try to take out a lot of technical terms out of it, because the better your docs is when it comes to, I think I always go with the try to explain your project as if I'm five, right? Using that, explain things as if I'm is a very good concept, because it kind of gives you an opportunity for you to better explain what you're all about. So good docs helps. Good docs first is important. Second is you need to build a community or a community or a project. Because when somebody's trying to approach a project, they want to make sure that they can reach out to people that are thinking the same way they're thinking, or the way we term it, like minds. Because when we have people in together and having some kind of a collaboration going on, it just kind of helps. So in terms of licensing, I would say it's based on your need. There's no right license. It's just based on what you want to do. But there are licenses for literally everything that you want to do in open source. One of the most popular licenses are MIT. I think we use something called the JPL version 3. But there's a lot of licenses out there. I'm not an expert in license, but you should probably check it out. But the most important thing, like I said, documentation is great. That is why even Google Citizen of Docs exists. That Google Citizen of Docs is designed for open source projects to keep getting better on the docs, right? And so that's something that you need to keep in mind.
Yeah, plus one, she said, having a documentation is like the very important thing. I think there was this survey that GitHub carried out recently, and one of the top problems people had was they were always saying incomplete documentation, or the documentation didn't exist. So if you want people to contribute to your project or be more active in your organization, I think having a good documentation is very important.
Yeah.
All right, cool. So we'll take in 2 more questions and then we'll wrap up. So the second to the last question is, how can we get sponsorship for open source projects? Do you know of any organizations that provide this kind of sponsorships?
So when you said, oh, sponsorship, is it sponsorship for individual or sponsorship for an organization? But I can answer both. So for an individual, there's no, I would say there's no straightforward way to do that. So one of the ways I was able to foot my bills, not being employed, while doing open source projects,
Mhm.
was to come up with ideas, and then I run projects, and then I get funded. So there's
Yeah.
the term there that we use a lot for individuals and also organizations. But then there are
Mhm.
programs that pays you, right? Google Sum of Code pays you. Google Season of Dog can also pay you. Outreachy pays you. There's a lot of programs out there that can pay you. But then there's
Mhm.
also an opportunity for you to go out and seek out for grants. They are publicly funded places. In fact, one of the project that I'm serving as a board member for, Open Source Collective, is designed for open source projects to show what they do and to ask for funding, right? So
Yeah.
myself and Edidiong, we are part of Open Source Community Africa, and when we wanted to do the Open Source Festival, we basically raised money from corporate companies that believe in open source, and we're able to add. We have a lot of money to run the program, so that just kind of gives you a clear idea on how to approach things from the organization standpoint and also personal standpoint when it comes to funding.
All right, that makes sense. All right, final question. Let me try to pick one final question. Examples of the product. Okay. All right, so the question is, how do you showcase your quality contributions? Is it easier to show job commits frequently than low value?
So quality contributions is so I don't think there's a way you can show quality contributions because the way there's no right metrics for that, to be honest with you. Even GitHub as a platform or any platform that tracks activities on contributions doesn't necessarily show quality contributions, right? So there's no right metrics for that. But the reason I said quality contributions is having great project that is designed and then you contribute to it in a quality way that somebody can
Yeah.
speak on your behalf. So
Mm-hmm.
there's the speaking on your behalf route that speaks basically for quality contribution. So for example, right, like I mentioned before, I stopped applying for jobs for some many reasons because I just don't, I believe hiring is broken. And because I have primarily focused on quality contributions, people started speaking on my behalf. This is something you see typically in the open source space because
Yeah.
myself and Edidiong, we can be working on a project. I see how amazing she works, and then I hear about an opportunity or something that is in line with what she does. But because I've been able to see what she focused on, that kind of gives room for reference and for an opportunity for connections. So that's something that you need to keep in mind. So there's no direct way for you to see quality contributions, but just know that your work would definitely speak for you when the time comes.
All right, that's fantastic. Thank you so much, Samson, for handling the session. You really highlighted like a lot of really key important factors about open source in general, contributing to open source, and how we can help you grow as like a developer or technical writer, like whatever. Like I mentioned earlier, you don't have to necessarily be a software developer to contribute to open source projects. It could be anything from like fixing a bug or fixing a typo in the documentation and stuff. So this was really amazing. Thank you so much. All right, so let me
Yeah.
read Samson's task. So for this particular session, the task is write about an open source project that's helped you grow as a developer. Or if you're not doing that one, next one is, have you created an open source project recently? Talk about it on your Hashnode blog. So let me just say that once more in case you didn't hear me. So there are two questions, so to speak, two tasks. So you can either work on either of them. So the first one is write about an open source project that has helped you grow as a developer, while the second one is, have you created an open source project recently? Talk about it on your Hashnode blog. So let me share that on this chat. All right, cool. So you could just find it there. All right, thank you so much for joining today's session, the final session of the Hashnode Bootcamp 3. We do hope you had an amazing time and also learned a lot from all the different speakers that joined in. Do keep in mind that your tax extension has been extended. So if you've not completed your tax, please complete it on or before 23rd of April, because we're going to give out certificates, right? And the only way we can give you the certificate is if you work on the task. So if you don't work on the task, we won't share the certificate with you. And if you don't have the certificate, there's no way to prove that you attended this awesome bootcamp. So that's why we decided to give you more time to work on your different tasks. And yeah, so we'll be giving out the certificates on or before 26th of April. So that's why we need you to work on your tasks by 23rd April. Don't forget to share what you've learned on Twitter or any social media platform of your choice using the hashtag Hashnode Bootcamp. Remember that we're going to give out t-shirts to the top tweets that we see. And the only way we can see these tweets is if you include Hashnode Bootcamp, right? That's the only way we can track it. So about what you've learned today from Samson's session, what you've learned generally, like overall in terms of the bootcamp, and tag Samson, tag Hashnode. Would love to see your tweets, or it doesn't have to be on Twitter, but it could be on LinkedIn or whichever platform you're most on. And we would look at that and announce the winners of the t-shirts soon. Thank you so much. Do have an amazing day ahead. And we're looking forward to seeing this your tweets and comments on social media. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you. All right.